Hi, I'm Eric, and I'm a social studies educator, historian, and host of this, the Everything is a Primary Source podcast. I'm also an avid collector of popular culture artifacts. I love what I find at thrift store outlets, garage sale leftovers, and what I spot just making my way around the built world. I enjoy sorting through boxes of free books and magazines, not to mention online collections like Internet Archive and, of course, the Library of Congress. But you don't need to spend your time digging through bins or following online rabbit holes to get a look into the past. The movies and TV we watch, the books we read, and the games we play are all documents of the past. So is fashion, food, music, toys, even the roads we travel on and the places we live and work in. Everything is a primary source. Robert, when things like movies, TV shows, all sorts of media, books like yours, um, about history come about, it's usually inspired by some piece of the past, a document, artifact, primary
hmm
source.
Legend.
Tell me
Yeah.
about Jeep Show. Where did that come
Yeah.
from?
My book, Jeep Show, A Trooper at the Battle of the Bulge, was inspired by a Procter and Gamble legend called the Oxydol Circus. Oxydol was a popular brand of detergent back in the day. Um, I started my career at Procter and Gamble and learned the story of the Oxydol Circus, which very briefly was a circus promoter sold the Oxydol brand manager on sponsoring a traveling circus. It turned out to be a disaster, humorous only in retrospect, but a disaster and found its way into Procter and Gamble lore. I had written a nonfiction book, and I thought I would write another one on the Oxydol Circus. I located the daughter of this circus promoter. He was a man named Jim Hetzer. And she said, "Oh yes, I have much documentation from his time as a circus promoter. But did you know that my father was an enlisted entertainer in World War II?" And I said, "No, I did not know there were enlisted entertainers in World War II." And she said, "Yes." They were in what was known as the Morale Corps, and these men, Military Occupation Specialty 442, did Jeep shows for combat infantry on the front lines in places where the USO and the Red Cross could not go.
Hmm.
Um, and I found that fascinating and thought I would write about that. And she said, by the way, my aunt, my father's older sister, saved every letter he wrote home from the European theater of operations in World
Oh,
War
wow.
II. So, and I said, as a history teacher, you can appreciate this. I said, "Oh my goodness, can I come down to Dallas and read these letters? I'll put on, cotton archival gloves and treat them very carefully." And she said, "Oh, don't bother. My sister published them in a book."
Oh.
So, so, so I got this book. It's called Mabel's Letters, and it has 150 letters that Jim Hetzer wrote home from the war in Europe. Uh, and so I had a very primary source understanding of what it was like to be this very unusual specialty in the Army, entertainment soldier. And by the way, Jim Hetzer, his Jeep Show squad, which is three of these enlisted entertainers and a driver, Mickey Rooney led his Jeep Show squad. Mickey Rooney, the
Yeah.
#1 Hollywood box office star of 1939, had joined the Army by 1944, and despite his fame and celebrity, was not afraid to take on this risky duty. The rest of the entertainment soldiers probably just had to follow orders, but Mickey Rooney probably had a choice, so I'm full of respect for him. So this real person, Jim Hetzer, was an entertainment soldier in World War II, did these Jeep shows at the front lines with Mickey Rooney, and I then stumbled in the endless internet, Eric, on um, the Army's manual for the Morale Corps issued in 1944, just before D-Day. And it is 50 or 60 pages of instructions of what materials are available to put on shows, the importance of morale,
Hmm.
and how to do it. So, it is, you attach trailer M117 to a Jeep, and you get microphone M22.7, and you hook it up to the Jeep's battery when you're doing the show, and all that. So I had two very unusual primary sources, all these letters, and then the operations manual. And at some point, I decided that this needed to be historical fiction, and it had something to do with the fact that the Battle of the Bulge in December and January of December of 1944, January 45, was the largest battle ever fought by the U.S. Army and a pivotal battle in ending World War II.
Hmm.
And I wanted to get this entertainment soldier involved in the Battle of the Bulge and Bastogne, and so I decided to make the book fiction. It is historically very accurate. One of the things I like best is I have given this book to historians and World War II buffs or World War II nerds, and I have probably become one myself. And no one that I have talked to yet is aware that there were enlisted men providing entertainment at the front lines. So there's always that surprise among these experts. So I wrote this book, and it has gotten a very good reception so far from, as I say, World War II buffs, because I made it as historically accurate as I could, and yet told a story. And the last thing I'll say about it is I'm also hoping, because it is a novel, that people who are a little intimidated by nonfiction accounts of World War II or the Battle of the Bulge, which are some of them are excellent, uh, will read this book and get an idea of what it was like to be in the army in Europe in 1944 and 1945, and in that way, even learn something they didn't know. I will mention my father was in the army in World War II, and there's a chapter in the book where the protagonist ships over on the Queen Mary troop ship, and my father indeed was sent to Europe at age 19 on the Queen Mary troop ship. So the writing project brought me closer to my dad, who's been gone for a long time, and that was very gratifying as well.
I was going to say that must have been a pretty amazing experience to be able to incorporate a fictional story and then have that ability to integrate your own
Yeah,
heritage, your own family
yeah,
line into that. That's
yes,
great opportunities. And I think there's, I mean, historic fiction has functioned in a lot of, for a long time as exactly what you're describing is your here's your conduit to history.
yeah,
And as long as it doesn't take on supernatural or science fiction
right, right,
qualities, it's
right.
doing its work. That's um I remember I didn't really like the way it ended, but Steven Spielberg had his amazing stories or the Disney series that they did, and there was a World War II episode with a flying fortress that was coming back. It was very Memphis Belle-esque,
Oh, yes,
and
yeah.
then the landing gear wouldn't come down, and the one of the guys on board the plane, one of the crew, was a cartoonist, amateur cartoonist, and he drew cartoon wheels and
Oh,
kind of willed
goodness.
it to grow it. So it was, and even at age like 8 or 9 when I saw it, I thought it was kind of ridiculous, but
Yeah,
it was doing its job of getting me interested into the real story of World War II. I
yeah.
couldn't find anything about cartoon
Right,
wheels sprouting from
right,
airplanes
right.
in all that I tried, but it was that way to get it. And my son is very interested in historic fiction. That's how he's learned about everything from 9/11 to the Battle of Gettysburg is through
Yeah,
these kinds of storytelling. So it's perfectly um, is functioning exactly as it should. Saying about entertainers, it's funny about World War II how a lot of the things that had existed in previous conflicts became very official in the Second World War, right? Having manuals and guidance and
Yes. Yeah.
departments and things like that. I was thinking about the 1898 war with Spain, the Spanish-American War. And how that was just like popular culture explosion of, all right, Annie Oakley's going to lead a group of
Right.
women on horseback to fight the Spaniards. And, Teddy Roosevelt actually did, form the Rough Riders out of his cowboy and Indian buddies. And,
Right. Right.
all these Harvard and Yale recruits, from the shooting team, and it
Yes.
was like, it was so, with that one, if it was against anybody else besides a dying empire that just happened to
Right. Right.
have holdings 90 miles from
Yeah.
Florida.
1,400 miles away from Spain. Yes, you're
Yeah,
absolutely
like
right.
then it would have been an absolute failure. It was a mess, but it kind of over the next, and I'm not super familiar with, because the idea of a celebrity, a mass media celebrity, is very much a post World War One
Hmm.
phenomenon. But you think about over the next 30, 40 years or so, that develops into something so that when the country goes to war again in 1941, it it's an all hands on deck. It's everybody,
Yeah.
but it's very official. It's by the books, right? There's like that photograph of Marilyn Monroe when she was working at the some kind of, it was like an early version of a drone factory.
Ah.
They'd use the small radio controlled airplanes for target practice, and that's
Hmm.
where she actually worked, like as Norma Jean
Wow.
Doherty. And there's a photograph, a series of photographs. Is her first modeling gig, and the credit for the photo is like 2 lines long because it's U.S. Army Air
Ah, yeah.
Corps Office of
Yes.
Photography,
Yeah.
and
Signal Corps. Yeah.
right, like
Yeah.
all these extensions. And so it's probably some Hollywood photographer guy that when the war came, he's like, all right, I'll get a job, I'll serve my
Right.
country by taking pictures of Marilyn Monroe. That's
Yeah.
if I have to do it, I
Yeah.
will. That kind of thing. Like everybody was on board with this. So it's what you're
Yeah.
describing is absolutely, it seems odd, but at the time it was like perfect fit. That's
Yeah.
exactly, here's your, and I love the idea of like, all right, if you're on the front lines and you really got to tell jokes and do a song and dance, hook up to this battery,
Yeah.
and
Hook
you
your
can do
mic
it.
up to the battery. Well, the
Mm,
Jeep was incredibly versatile. Going back to your point about the Spanish-American War and kind of the eccentric formations we had, by World War II, as you say, things were by the book. And one of the most important things I discovered as I did my research was the Army was representative of the nation as a whole in the early 40s, in that the Marines and the Navy and the Army Air Force combined were much smaller than the Army itself. So the
mm,
Army had to rely on the draft, whereas the other branches did not. The Army had to rely on the draft, and so so it represented the country as a whole. The Army drafted PhDs. The Army drafted immigrants who could not even speak English. They had to teach them English
mm,
as part of their basic training. And the Army drafted working people. The Army drafted everybody. My father told me that one of the boys in his outfit in basic training said uh, the shoes, the boots that the Army gave him were the first pair of shoes that he'd ever owned for
oh my,
himself. He was,
yeah.
he was probably from Appalachia or some, very poor area. So the Army in World War II was a fabulous representation of the country as a whole and very interesting. And it was very much citizen soldiers. These men voted in the 1944 election, from the Pacific or from Europe, and their parents and their wives wrote letters to their congressmen complaining
Hmm.
about things. Uh, and these men in general were somewhat skeptical towards their officers and somewhat skeptical towards military hierarchy, which they called quote unquote chicken shit.
Hmm.
And it was just fascinating to understand how the army, you know, 8 million strong was, really gave a great cross section of the nation as a whole. I learned a lot from that.
And I suppose it's long been that way, but it as time went on probably dissipated a little bit. You know, when you get into the 60s with the Vietnam War and the
Right.
draft there, it doesn't seem to be as quite as the cross section
Right.
of America that because there's a lot of exceptions to being
Absolutely right.
drafted into that, and so you do end up with mostly poor working class
Yes. Most, yeah,
college
absolutely.
dropouts and
Right.
or people
Yeah.
that didn't go to college at all, didn't have families,
Yeah. It
and
was
so
not egalitarian the way it was in World War II. It was
mm,
not egalitarian. And as of course, the country was not put on a war footing, either for the Korean War or the Vietnam War. So it was very much, not on people's minds, every minute of the day as World War II was.
So we're going to talk about the actual vehicle itself, the Jeep
Yes,
today, and just like a lot of aspects of World War II, I feel like the vehicles, the different machinery, the weapons of war are a product of that particular war. A couple years ago, we visited the USS Midway, which is a museum in San Diego now, and that ship, that carrier, was introduced in just after World War II in I think 1946 and named after that naval battle. And they said that it was designed to be able to win World War II all by itself. And I think about other things that came about in World War II. I mean, we of course have the atomic bomb,
yes,
but on a smaller scale, you have jet engines and all of these revolutions. Now, the Jeep is also a product of World War II, correct?
absolutely. Yeah, in 1940, with war clouds, well, not war clouds gathering. In 1940, with war having broken out in Europe, the Army issued a request for basically a reconnaissance vehicle, a light vehicle, versatile. It was intended to replace a horse for reconnaissance or a motorcycle. And three companies submitted designs: the Bantam Car Company, Willys Overland, and then Ford Motor Company. So this was the Army looking ahead and trying to prepare for our involvement in the war, which, by the way, in 1940, there was still tremendous sentiment in the United States to not enter the war and leave what was considered, Europe's problems to be solved by Europeans.
Mhm.
So Bantam, very small car company, developed the first prototype, which was tested. The Army ordered, 30 or 40 and tested them, and found them to be very satisfactory. The Army considered Bantam too small to produce and not financially uh, big enough to produce the kinds of quantities they were going to need. By the way, the Army ended up buying 650,000 Jeeps
Oh my
before the
goodness.
before the war ended. It was the other than the Deuce and the General Motors truck, which was called a Deuce and a half, which was 800 produced in eight quantities of 800,000. The Jeep was the largest production of a vehicle or an airplane or a boat in World War II. A good deal of that production went to the Russians and the British and the French to help them fight, particularly before we entered the war. So Willys Overland and Ford essentially submitted final designs. The Willys Overland design was selected, but the Army insisted that the production be shared with Ford Motor Company. And it gets to a point that is about defense procurement that we still have today, which is the defense establishment prefers to deal with the very largest companies. There are probably political reasons for that,
Mm.
and the Army has to, the defense establishment has to pay close attention to Congress, who has the power of the purse. But also, the Army wants reliability. They can't afford to give, Willys Overland a requisition for 500,000 Jeeps and find out, a year later they can only make 50,000. So
Right.
they added Ford to it. Interestingly, basically, they also insisted that Ford work off the exact same set of blueprints that Willys had. So Ford probably produced, half of the Jeeps, and Willys Overland produced the other half. I'm not sure what happened to Bantam Car Company. Hopefully they got paid something for basically, inventing the prototype. But it was produced by Willys and Ford. Willys was a scrappy mid-tier automobile company, mostly industrial vehicles before the war, and by adding Ford, the Army added incredible mass production knowledge. And this gets me to a larger point about America and American history. By early 1944, America was turning out more war material than Germany, England, Japan, and Italy combined.
Wow.
Uh, the American war production and the German army at the time, or the German soldiers, would tell you that, America beat them not because they were better soldiers, but because they had more stuff.
Right.
And indeed, they did. By by 1944, mid 44, the other armies, be it the British, the Germans, or the Japanese, were running out of men and running out of things, running out of material.
Right.
And the American army was only strengthening. And this came from American car culture. In the 20s, if you started in 1920 and then took another look in 1929, America went from the automobile being a curiosity for wealthy people to the Model T and the automobile being something for literally every working man,
Right.
for every man. It went from, I don't know, many thousands in 1920 to many millions of automobiles by 1929. In the process, America perfected mass production, and that came into play when the production was shifted to war material. Not only was America the world's expert on mass production, and mass production is essentially simplifying the production steps to their very, very basic and distributing them. So you don't have a team of people building a Model T as they might have had in Germany or Japan with their automobiles. Instead, you have a man, fastening a bolt here, and then it goes down the line, and another man puts in a windshield and goes down the line, and distributing tasks and breaking them down to their simplest part. So America had this incredible knowledge that really none of the other developed economies had of mass production. And then, as you know, Eric, we went through a terrible depression in the from about 1929 to literally about 1940. So not only did America have incredible knowledge of mass production, but half of our industrial base was idle. So
Yeah.
when the federal government started writing huge checks to industry for, everything from Jeeps to Liberty ships to B-17 bombers, uh, there was industrial capacity and an idled workforce ready to take that on. So the Jeep very much and the Jeep's production by the very large Ford Motor Company very much kind of shows how American society was at the time. And Ford not only produced, 300,000 Jeeps, but they produced, 100,000 B-20, I think it's B-25, 100,000 bombers, and they produced Liberty ships. Ford, as all the big automotive manufacturers did, turned itself completely over to military production. The last civilian car to roll off the assembly line was, I think, in April of 1942, and then there literally were no civilian cars produced until late
Yeah.
1945. So very much the Jeep is very much symbolic of the American economy, the American mass production techniques, and then the Depression's effect on the availability of workers and uh, industrial capacity.
And their desire to work too. I mean,
Oh yeah,
it was such a, and in many ways, the overproduction in the 1920s that resulted in that massive car culture
yeah,
was prompted by the previous World War of a lot of that disillusionment or let's think about now instead of the future
right,
that came the
right,
attitude of the last generation or more of a practical thing of well we're the only economy still intact
yeah,
and geographically we didn't get hurt at all by the war so let's take advantage of that and make but the law of diminishing marginal utility makes it so
right,
that even though every man can now afford a car, every man can't afford two or three. And
right,
so if they're still
right,
pushing out all of these Model Ts or if GM's making
right,
cars or
right,
Oldsmobile, they run out of customers after a while. You know,
yeah,
that people just can't buy them anymore. And that was kind of lurking under the surface throughout the end of the 20s to the point where when the bottom falls out of the stock market and then when the
right,
geographic hazards like the Dust Bowl really start
right,
no pun intended, cropping up,
right.
then it's that festering problem. It just shows itself even more. But I was thinking about I had a conversation. I grew up in a Air Force family. My dad was in the Air
Ah,
Force, and um, so I met a lot of my friends from all over the country, and I was having a friendly conversation with a friend of mine who was from Arkansas about the Civil War.
hmm,
And I won't put on the accent because it's kind of rude, but
yeah,
he basically said, "Well, the reason why you Yankees won the Civil War is because you had more men and more stuff." And I'm like, "Well, yeah, that's how you win a war." Uh,
right, right,
and so there's a parallel between both those conflicts. You know, the North had the industry, the North had
right,
the manpower, that had regular immigration coming in to fill the factories and free up.
right,
I think at any one time there's only about one third of the uh, you know soldiering population was actually in uniform fighting in the war. That
hmm,
two-thirds of the male population that was able to fight or capable of was farming or they
right,
were in the factories or some kind
right,
of other thing. And when you compare the two, which they always are, Civil War and World War II, it makes sense that that would happen because of what was on the line for both of those conflicts. Um, in the Civil War, it was the country's future, and World War
right,
II is very much the world's future. And I think
right,
that, you know, even if the idea of a world being destroyed, the world being taken over by totalitarianism was something
yeah,
that alarmed the democratic countries of the world to the point where
absolutely,
they mobilized the way that you're describing. And man, just talk about um, the you put it so well as far as the Jeep is even more so an American ideal because cars are by nature the road uh,
right,
capable cars are very much a representation of Americans' desires for independence, that we don't like to be on other people's
right,
schedules. We
right,
if want
Right.
to at 2 a.m., to start our trip early, we can jump in the car and, beat the traffic, and we navigate our everyday life through our ability to just jump in the car and have our own,
Yeah.
kind of like part of our home on, depending on how well we keep it clean or not, it actually looks like your home driving around. Well, the Jeep is even more of that because it doesn't require roads, right? It's like
Right.
you were saying with the horseback. It's like it can go anywhere, and it was meant to do that. Um, I want to talk more about the attitudes and ideas it conveys, but I'm just kind of curious. When I think of Jeep, and I've owned a Jeep, I owned a
Ah,
Jeep Patriot,
yeah.
which was not as great as it sounds. It was actually pretty. It was the same as a Dodge Caliber. So eventually, Dodge is the one that's producing Jeeps. When
Yeah.
did that handover take
I
place?
think American Motors, you may not be old enough to remember American Motors, but there was the big three when I was a kid was Ford, GM, and American Motors. American
AMC,
Motors,
right?
yeah, AMC. They bought at some point Willys Overland. So American Motors was producing the Jeep. I want to go back though. I think a really important point about why the Jeep is so representative. I think you made a great point about the American psyche. So first of all, and I'd like to elaborate a little bit on it if you don't mind. Obviously, we
Sure.
talked about America's unique mass production capabilities. But you mentioned mobility. Yes, the Jeep was incredibly mobile in the war and of course afterwards. It could go off-road, it could go in snow, it could go almost everywhere in the Pacific, in the jungles. And mobility, both physical mobility and social mobility, are a hallmark of America in the 20th century. So physical mobility, as you know, Eric, there was mass migrations from the South by black citizens and others to the North, to the industrial cities of the North, but after World War One, massive mobility. And then during the war, the defense industries hired so many workers, and the workers' pay was so much better than it had been before the war, that again, there was another huge wave of immigration from one part of the country to where the defense industries were. So the Jeep's mobility, if you will, is very much representative of the physical mobility and the tendency of Americans to uproot themselves and move to another part of the country at a moment's notice.
Yeah.
Then, of course, America is somewhat unique in the social mobility in that even to this day, um, lesser resourced people, people with lower incomes, accept the idea of an elite class of billionaires because they feel in some way that they could get there themselves.
Hmm.
That social mobility we don't have and didn't have the British class structure system holding us back. And so the mobility of the Jeep very much symbolizes, and it could only have come from America. And then the Jeep was egalitarian. General Eisenhower drove around in a Jeep.
Yeah.
So did Private Jim Tanzer in my book because everybody used a Jeep. And again, very very symbolic of Americans' egalitarian, at least hopes and dreams. And again, I want to emphasize we had a citizen soldier army. They were never completely, committed to the army. They were committed, soldiers were committed to their buddies,
Hmm.
but they were never completely committed to the army, and they never lost sight of the fact that they were citizens, had the right to vote, had the right to complain. So again, the egalitarian nature of the Jeep in World War II very much symbolized America. Now that you've brought it up, I don't know that there is a manufactured item that better symbolizes what America stood for in the 20th century.
It even looks American. I mean, just something about it is it's like it like later on. in the jet age, and they still have them, the A-10 Warthog to
Ah,
me is
yes,
always
yes.
like the ultimate. Yeah, and there's much prettier planes
Yeah,
out there.
stubby
Yeah,
and dangerous, stubby and threatening looking.
yeah, it kind
Yeah,
of has that similar. It's like a flying Jeep almost. It has
yeah,
that
yeah,
utilitarian look to
yeah.
it, and that's what's it's interesting to me because nowadays a really nice Jeep Cherokee,
Oh,
it's like a luxury vehicle.
yeah.
That's
Oh,
not
yeah,
something that you
yeah.
can just up and go buy.
Right,
If you're working as a carpenter or something. I mean,
right,
it's like
right.
you are a status symbol if you're driving
It's
that around.
it's a suburban, soccer parent vehicle.
Right.
Yes. And in some ways my trade used to be marketing, Eric, and they're getting away from their heritage, and that's very dangerous. Because that's not, $85,000 luxury vehicle with
Mm.
large tires is not really their heritage.
Have they gone
uh,
electric? Or because that wouldn't seem very Jeep of them to be an electric Jeep because it seems like that would
Yeah,
almost
yeah.
require.
I don't know. I'm not in the market. I do think that I would like to get a World War II Jeep restored and, drive around the country to bookstores, and pull up and, talk about my book. But
Yeah.
my wife has forbid that, so we won't be.
Well, I'll tell you, there was I was probably say about 10 or 11 years ago. I was borderline wondering if it was in good taste or poor taste, but they did have
Yeah.
Jeep commercials that involved at least it was hinting at the beaches of Normandy, if
Mm,
not the actual ones. And they showed
yeah.
these Jeeps and they showed the World War II. They had like footage of it, and then they,
Yeah.
showing you them being able to climb over rocks and doing,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
they posed the old Jeep with the newer models on, the beach, and
Hmm.
made that parallel
Yeah.
and very directly like this,
Yeah.
we because that kind of resurgence of greatest generation celebration,
Yeah.
came in the late 90s when,
Yes.
people of course recognized that that generation was
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 leaving us.
leaving
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
quickly.
Yeah.
And so we have a series of movies, and I kind of categorize that commercial with a lot of those video games that were coming out around the same time of like,
Yeah.
okay, it can be good, but let's make sure we recognize this was a real thing for people. It wasn't,
Yeah.
those guys didn't get to just hit restart,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
They weren't,
Yeah. Get a new life.
and they and his History Channel had, World War II in HD.
Right.
I'm like, well, I'll
Right.
tell you who is in high definition for
Yeah.
like the people that were
Yeah.
there.
Yeah. One
And
of the
it,
things I came away with, Eric, that is, and in reading many letters and accounts, we should never glorify war. It is a terrible business, and the suffering is done by, 10 to 12% of all the soldiers, and of course the civilians at the front line. So it's not egalitarian in the distribution of wounds and death. And yeah, I'm very, very much again. I'm not a pacifist, but I'm very, very much against anyone glorifying war, and I certainly stayed away from that, and in fact tried to give kind of descriptions of the semi-misery that
yeah,
frontline combat soldiers go through in terms of just general discomfort and then constant risk of wounds and death.
making all the need for a morale core,
Yeah,
people that
yeah,
would, and and of course, wonderful thing that USO participants do
oh
by
yeah,
going, but the person that's in the military and then willing to go to the front line,
yes. Well,
in the shadow,
ordered
ordered,
to
yeah,
go to the front
but
line. Yeah,
willing to be enlisted to, so they
yeah,
knew that that was
yeah,
part of the
yeah,
game. It
yeah,
wasn't, and I mean, there's a pretty significant list of movie stars that enlisted in the military. Clark
yeah,
Gable was
yeah,
one, Jimmy Stewart.
yeah.
It was,
Jimmy Stewart was extraordinary because he was actually a bomber pilot. And that was even more dangerous than frontline combat infantry. So
Yeah.
many of the others did find service, but never went overseas, never were exposed to, everyone has their job. And I think veterans will tell you they don't look down on any military job. But Mickey Rooney, who figures in the book, enlisted in 1944, he could have done his service in Hollywood, making films for the
Yeah.
instructional films and selling bonds at Hal Roach Studios, about 10 minutes from his house in Beverly Hills. Lieutenant Ronald Reagan did excellent duty there during the war, but Rooney chose to go overseas and be involved with in the Morale Corps and be involved with these frontline Jeep shows. And I've been reading a couple of autobiographies of his, and I've kind of puzzled out in my own mind that Mickey Rooney was a genius actor and talent. His lifestyle was ruinous. I mean, he was a 24/7 party when he wasn't working and doing brilliant work. He was partying and working his way through the Hollywood starlets and drinking and taking pills and just living a wild life. And I kind of surmised that, and no one told me this, but I kind of surmised that his willingness to not just enlist, and there was some pressure to enlist, but to go to the front was, I think, in some way, and perhaps subconscious, trying to escape essentially the ruinous life that he was living as a, off the charts Hollywood star.
Yeah.
So yes, I would never want to glorify war. What I tried to do was give a portrait of frontline soldiering at that time, December 1944.
And Mickey Rooney actually looks kind of like a Jeep, so it works out. He's all short and
Yes,
stocky, and
that
had
was
that.
yes, absolutely. In fact, is one of his jokes he would say during Jeep shows, and they did up to 12 a day at
Wow.
frontline strong points. One of his standard jokes was, I'm not in a big hurry to get back to Hollywood because I'm too short to be a leading man and I'm too tall to be a producer. And
Inside Hollywood humor that must have gone
yes,
well with those guys.
exactly,
Like, oh, okay,
exactly.
I can
Yeah,
relate. Well, and
yeah,
that's what's I think it's we always remark on that era and the celebrities that went off to war in some capacity or another or served.
yeah.
It was the short list. Ronald Reagan was from Illinois. Uh, Clark Gable was from Ohio. I am pretty
Right.
sure Jimmy Stewart was a Midwestern guy. I don't think he
Sounds like
was
it. Sounds
from
like it. Yeah,
Hollywood. But when you look at Internet Movie Database, for example, a lot of the current stars, people, even last generation stars, they're all from LA. They're
yeah,
from that culture. And so and nothing against them
yeah.
at all, but it's kind of like maybe the reason for that uh desire to be there with their fellow, because that that real divide hadn't really set in yet, that there wasn't
Right,
an isolation
right,
of their community. They were themselves migrants, like you described,
right,
to
right.
and LA was a manufacturing giant as well,
Oh,
not just Hollywood. I mean,
absolutely. The
they're making
aircraft. Yeah.
aircraft
Yep.
especially,
Yes.
so it wasn't like they were completely removed from that, but it was when you have an entire population that is kind of, it's self-feeding. I mean,
Yeah.
kind of close where you live, Tennessee,
Right.
more Nashville, but has become a magnet for people from all over the country.
Right.
And therefore, you might have different viewpoints on things, different attitudes than
Yeah.
say 30 years ago in
Oh,
the
yeah.
same place. But I'll reduce my rambling and just say I think this is all just like one giant, gestation of, and I think the Jeep is that great touchstone that keeps bringing it back together
Absolutely.
over
Absolutely.
again.
they sold, as you were saying, with most war material, the war ended, and there were many, many, many surplus war materials of all kinds. And the government sold the surplus Jeeps after World War II to whoever wanted them for $715 a piece.
Wow.
And the first people to buy them, as you'd expect, were farmers and mining companies and loggers and that kind of thing. And then Willys, because Ford left off producing Jeeps, they didn't own the blueprints and they were making civilian cars as fast as they could. Willys kept making the Jeep and they actually developed the civilian model and marketed it in the late 40s and 50s, and it was never a huge seller, but based on that, American values of mobility and off the road freedom.
I, I always think about Jeeps pre the Cherokee, pre that
Oh yeah,
era
yes.
of the
Yeah,
SUV. Throughout the 70s and 80s, if somebody drove a Jeep, it exuded this idea of them being an adventurer, that
yeah.
they, would, a lot of them didn't even have doors. They would, just have the
Right.
flaps and
Oh
everything.
yeah,
And
yeah.
it was kind of dangerous just even driving around. You just picture, the people that had those probably wore some kind of vest, and or looked like sunglasses and going off like, well, I'm on a road right now, but you'll never know. I might just take
Right,
that
right.
logging trail off the side of the highway, and
Well,
you'll
and
never.
even today, Eric, if you stop the 19-year-old young man who is driving the base Jeep model, he's into the fact that the door is held on by a huge hinge, which is completely, is stuck on the outside of the
Yeah,
door, and that it's an uncomfortable ride, the basic Jeep even now, and it's very stiff, and the suspension is very stiff, and that 19-year-old kid, that's what he wants, he wants
yeah.
that sense that this is a rough and tumble vehicle that represents my, masculinity. The high end, yeah, that's become a comfort vehicle, but there still is, if you get the low end model, you'll find most of the drivers are male and under 30.
It's funny, the vehicle that, as far as I know, in the military that more or less replaced the Jeep was the Humvee,
Yes.
and popularized by Schwarzenegger because he had one of
Yeah.
his own. But those were instantaneously quasi luxury status
Yeah.
symbol vehicles. They
Yeah.
started, I'm sure, somewhere around 50 grand.
Yes.
But look at how quickly they faded out of popularity.
Yeah.
I mean, the Range Rover, I think, is now the preferred one. But that it's
Yes.
not as wide. It doesn't look like it could be in a war.
Right.
It's like this, the Humvees, they had their day in the sun for about 10 years at the beginning of the 21st century, but they quickly faded away, and now Jeep's back again. And
Yeah, I had a friend who
Jeep's
had
never gone away.
a friend of mine had a Humvee and I drove in it a time or two. It was incredibly uncomfortable and unsuitable for anything other than, driving, in military purpose. I mean, it was absurd, but that's a classic peek at America, let's take it out of the status. Forget about the fact that this gets 7 miles per gallon. There's almost no space inside the thing, and it's really hard to drive. Yeah, I had not thought about the replacement of the Jeep, but it was indeed the Hummer, and I do remember when the Hummer was popular.
Was the king, and it was all
Yeah.
the celebrities had them, and
Yes.
it was their way of and showing them just how big you could be.
Right,
It was
right.
popular.
Absurd in retrospect.
I've heard this. I'm not sure it's true, but you're the person to ask. The
Yeah.
term Jeep, did that come from the sound that it makes? Was that how it got its name, or was it pre-packaged as a Jeep?
No one knows. There are a couple of theories. That might be one. The Bantam company, the company that did the first prototype, I think they had GPT, it was a Bantam prototype GPT, and there was some idea that, that devolved into just Jeep. And by the way, I did not use this in the book because I thought it would be confusing, but there were nicknames within the Army for the Jeep. It was called the Peep,
Hmm.
P-E-E-P, as much as it by soldiers in the war, as much as it was called the Jeep. So, uh, but the origin of the original name of Jeep is shrouded in history.
I suppose at this point it doesn't really matter because it's taken on a life of its own.
Right.
You see that simple word, you see the vertical lines of the grill,
Hmm.
and and especially with the base model, you see those circular lights, and it's instantaneous. You know what it is, and it's representation of all those things. So I think once again, your book not only functions as a great way to get us into the time period and see it, but also to keep alive the story behind the actual vehicle and its popularity. That it wasn't just something that was dreamed up
Right.
in peacetime and as the next great SUV.
Right.
That this was like
Right.
the original one, really.
Yeah.
And it
Yeah.
was fun, designed to, and I guess the kind of visionary in a way. They always have that saying of, when America goes to war, it starts by fighting the previous war. That they're because it's like, when you have a free society like ours,
Right.
a republic, um, pre large standing military that in
Right.
like the citizen soldiery you're talking
Right.
about, that's what you're left with. You have guns and equipment left over from the previous
Right.
conflict at the
Uniforms.
armory.
Yeah.
You're
Yeah.
not going to
Yeah.
be, um, and and it's, but then you have this vehicle. This might have been the original. All right, let's be proactive
Yeah.
versus reactive. Like we know because we're just in war
Right.
20 years
Or
ago in this
yeah.
place. Like
Yeah.
let's.
Yeah. And they're already
Um,
fighting. They're already fighting. Germany has already invaded France by that time. So yes.
did the Marines use the Jeep in the
The
Pacific at
Marines
all?
used the Jeep in the Pacific, as did the Army. Yes, they did not have their own vehicle. Interestingly, the German equivalent was called the Kubelwagen, and it was made by Volkswagen, designed by Mr. Porsche and made by Volkswagen. It did not match the Jeep in terms of off-road performance. Uh, very highly engineered, as many German weapons were. But the most interesting statistic is, again, going back to American mass production, the German Kubelwagen, which was equivalent to the Jeep, they produced all of 60,000 vehicles. We produced 650,000. Even more so, the Japanese had a vehicle called the Kurogane 95. Again, kind of their equivalent of the Jeep, lighter and smaller, but for the same purpose, scouting and reconnaissance.
Mhm.
They produced 4,800 units.
Oh my goodness.
So
That's
again, the one of the things that really gets reinforced to me during my research is the American production and the American economy was so much greater than the other belligerents
yeah.
in an American way.
Yeah. I mean, and between those three countries, uh, we were the only and still are a continental sized country
Correct.
and have the resources to produce those kinds of things. And another way it just represents uh the attitudes and the
Right.
behaviors
Right.
at
Yeah.
hand there.
The
And
exception, American exceptionalism is a long-standing tradition. It also helped that we were too far away to be bombed in
right.
World War II. We are not too far away to be bombed now, unfortunately, but in World War II, so our industrial production could go on with no threat of being bombed, whereas we blanket bombed German industrial production that we weren't as successful as we hoped we would be, and certainly we blanket bombed the Japanese mainland as well. So the American exceptionalism, part of that was having two giant oceans between us
Right.
and our enemies.
it the Second World War is absolutely a war of economies of
Yes,
just
yes.
different economies, and not only what they can produce, but theories behind them too. Just
That's well said.
uh,
That's well said. Yeah, the German weapons, like the much feared Tiger tank, highly engineered, had its own set of parts, very different from the other tanks, and was frequently breaking down. The American Sherman tank, which was smaller and outgunned by the German Tiger tank or even the Panthers, was available in much larger numbers, was highly reliable, and you could switch and had replaceable parts. Typical difference. The German weapons were beautifully engineered and, almost artisan things. The same with the Japanese Zero, their fighter plane. The American designs were much simpler, much more basic, and produced in 10 times the quantities.
I love it. It's
Yeah.
it's exactly what you would get from 1940s
Yes.
America,
Yes.
and
Yes.
it's
Mass production and a consumer, we had become a consumer-oriented society in the 20s. And so we weren't just mass producing cars, we were mass producing washing machines and what ice boxes they called them back then, and vacuum cleaners and whatever, tractors. So yeah, that was a great strength in war production.
it's been wonderful talking to you about the Jeep and your book Jeep Show. Where can people obtain a copy of Jeep Show?
Thank you, Eric, and it's been a real privilege to talk with you and your audience. Jeep Show, A Trooper at the Battle of the Bulge is available on Amazon in print, ebook, and audiobook. And then if you don't like Amazon, it is also available on bookshop.org.
It's been wonderful, like I said, talking to you about this. And I encourage everybody who's interested in any of those topics, whether it be Jeeps, World War II, Hollywood, and its various levels of involvement in this, to get a copy of this right away. And of course, as usual, feel free to join the conversation over at everything-history.com and share your own stories about Jeep and the uh, various topics of this particular discussion. Thanks again.
My pleasure. Thanks so much, Eric.
Popular culture, by definition, connects and unites us and proves that people of different backgrounds, in fact, have a lot in common with one another. I hope you enjoyed this conversation, at least in part, for that reason. If it connects with you and you'd like to add to it, or any of the podcast episodes, just visit everything-history.com and search for the Everything is a Primary Source project, which can be found in the classroom section of the website. We'd love to hear what you have to say. Be sure to rate and share this podcast wherever you are listening to it now, and follow Everything as a Primary Source on social media, including YouTube and especially Instagram. Thank you for listening to the EPS podcast, where everything is a primary source.